Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project. I'm sitting down here to speak with Derek Wills, otherwise known as Ancap Air, for a little discussion about all things libertarianism. Um, I'll pass it over to Derek in a minute to introduce himself a little bit more to detail, but I will put links for Derek's work in the description, his Twitter handle, or X as it's now known, and where you can find a lot of articles, very interesting articles. I've been reading a few and I plan to read many more. So before I pass over to Derek, I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate the invite, and what you were telling me about just trying to have conversations with people, whether they're like-minded or not. I find it to be really important. If for no other reason, to critique our own selves and our own philosophies to understand why we believe what we believe. I think it's incredibly important, and I appreciate that that's your main motivation here. So I thank you for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
Appreciate it. Um, Right, well, we'll just dive straight in. For your benefit and also for the benefit of everyone listening, I'll just introduce quickly my little project, which is called the Nations of Sanity. It's based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. So basically, our idea is let's make the NAP the law, but let's do it as the terms of a peace agreement, because obviously we can't do it through any kind of ruling authority because that would contradict the principle itself. So that's kind of the project in a nutshell, and my kind of my logic behind it. I don't think I'll get much pushback from you when I say that I feel like um, crime and law can only really be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership in a coherent way. And because that's kind of like a logical obviousness, the next step is like, well, okay, but there's obviously the contradiction of law with governments and things like that, because governments themselves are criminal according to this very principle. So I look at it and I think, well, the only way it can really be established as any kind of formalized law would be as like the terms of a peace agreement, because equal free people can have a peace agreement, and we don't need a ruling authority. In fact, we shouldn't have a ruling authority, because as I say, that would be criminalized by that very law. And the other kind of sort of logic behind it, from my perspective, is if we establish it as the terms of peace, as opposed to as I say, like like a ruling authority that's saying, this is wrong because I say so. We're saying, you can't do this, not because not the non-aggression principle won't be the law because I say so or you say so or under anyone's authority. We're basically saying that it's the only time we can justifiably use force against people is in this kind of defensive manner. And the beauty of the whole kind of thing in my mind is that there's a kind of objective truth to it, which is difficult to attain when you come into the realms of morality, because obviously morality itself is, it's not really an objective thing. You can't get an ought from an is a very famous kind of saying. But the way I kind of get around that, or kind of step past that, is say, well, yes, you can't get an ought from an is, but what you can do, or what you have to do if you want to make that journey from is to ought, is to add either a hypothetical imperative or a presupposition. And for me, the only one that works is individual self-ownership. Anything else just falls apart underneath itself because it becomes incoherent with a contradiction down the line. Whereas if we use individual self-ownership as our definition of crime and law, rights and freedom, if that's how we define those concepts, then everything is universalizable, everything's internally consistent, everything works. I
Yeah.
don't see any argument against it, and I always invite people to kind of argue against it. um, and yeah, that's my pitch, if you like.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, as I say, I know you're an anarchist, you're a libertarian, you promote these same principles yourself. So I'm preaching to the choir with 99% of this. I suppose the only kind of thing that the Nations of Sanity project kind of has its kind of uniqueness, if you like, is this very specific idea of saying, well, why don't we try to actually establish it like I say, only through a peace agreement, but and in some kind of way to actually create a free society, because it's a little bit like, and so I don't mean to go on, but it's a little bit like saying it's all very well to not practice slavery, but is slavery still a legitimate thing that everyone practices and is not recognized as criminal, as was once the case in our past? Then those people that don't practice it and oppose it, they're all well and good. Just like we can all be sitting our moral high ground as anarchists because we don't, advocate for taxation and all these other violations, but we don't live in a free society because that's not how the society is structured and operates. And I just kind of want to get us there, like the journey you could argue that we've taken with regards to slavery, of actually abolishing it and recognizing it's criminal, which doesn't get rid of it completely. Rape's
Hmm.
illegal, but it still happens, but it's
Right.
recognized as a crime universally, pretty much. It's recognized as a crime. And I just feel like all we need to do is get there with everything connected to the individual self-ownership. And for a lot of people who aren't even libertarians, I think they can recognize that, because even their own instinct guide them in that direction. And I just think if we just show them the principle that underpins that, I think we can make a lot of progress. Sorry, I went on a little bit there, but what do you think of that?
No, I mean, honestly, it sounds great. I think that a lot of the issues that libertarians and anarchists have is in messaging, and it's not it's despite our best efforts. It's not that we have a problem articulating it. It's that we're trying to articulate to people who have been conditioned to believe the opposite of what we preach as being truth, and it's the vast majority of people, and we're trying to figure out ways to break that conditioning, which is a difficult task, and it can only be done individual to individual. You're never going to deprogram the masses in one fell swoop. I mean, theoretically you could, but it would be very difficult to do. Right now, everybody's main focus, here in the States, is Trump versus Kamala, and that's it. They're not even going to be receptive to the ideas of true individual self ownership and true individual autonomy, uh, because right now all they know is living in this statist box. They don't know how to quite think outside the box. A great analogy that I like to use a lot is the Matrix, where Morpheus is talking with Neo and says that we see all these people, the very people that we're trying to save, but right now they're so dependent on the system that they will fight to preserve it. And I think it's a great analogy because it really highlights the struggle that we as libertarians, we as anarchists face trying to deprogram the masses. Even though we're trying to save them, they are still kind of our enemy in a lot of ways because they will fight to defend that very system that enslaves them. So, I mean, I love that you're taking another approach to try and highlight this. I'm working on my own separate approach. I'm pitching it. I've talked a little bit about it on Twitter recently. I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been writing it down. But it's a new ethical theory that I'm trying to push, that I call the theory of natural ethics. And I basically, it boils down to and this is going to resonate with any libertarian or anarchist that is listening, is that the crux of every single ethical question is whether or not consent is provided. And that's it. And if consent isn't required, then I would say that it's ethically neutral. And so, my take on this is trying to approach it from a far more philosophical standpoint, but also one that simplifies the logic to a way people can understand. And hopefully that helps win over more minds than we have so far. And honestly, the more approaches that we have to try and achieve this end, the better. Because as long as the end goal is the same for all of us, then the approach doesn't really matter, and the approach could be beneficial for one group of people and not for another, and then another approach could be beneficial for the group that's not. So this diversification of philosophies and applications is honestly a really good thing.
Sure, definitely. And I mean, also, I think it's important to kind of recognize that there's going to be opportunities for synergy of effort where
Hmm.
we're kind of running on the same vibe, on the same frequency, however you want to kind of word it. And then there's going to be times when there's going to be like conflicts where there's like disagreements and stuff like that. And I always think that's a perfect opportunity for debate. As I said before, not necessarily to change minds, although that's always a potential, a possibility if their person, is open-minded and of good faith and all that. But more to kind of you get clarity on your side of it, you get clarity of their side of it, and sometimes you can illuminate some kind of common ground that you may not have realized that you had before. And I'd really like, I mean, funny enough, I've got two projects now because I have the Nations of Sanity project that I just described, which is obviously presenting this very specific, let's do it this way kind of thing. And I've recently started up a channel called Together Strong, which is like another project, if you like, which is more about, it's not about specifically the Nation Sanity Project, though I obviously want to throw that in there. But it's about everybody basically, or as many people as I can try to get to be involved with it, presenting ideas like you would with yourself, debating different topics where libertarians have disagreements and stuff like that, but doing it in a kind of way, like for example with the debates. I've done one video already for this channel, which was a debate with Walter Block and Stefan Kinsella on the subject of voluntary slavery. I use the quotes voluntary slavery.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, spoiler alert, I'm on Stefan's side of that particular debate, but it was a really good debate to have, because even though it seems like a bit of a fringe issue in many ways about like, oh, is it right in an Ancap society for people to enter into voluntary contracts? It's like, well, we don't even have an Ancap society kind of thing. But it was still very interesting, apart from the fact that I think it's an issue worth debating in of itself. But what I found very interesting, as well as, I mean, Walter gave great arguments for his side, but I thought there was also some bad ones in there as well, which is why I kind of sided with Stefan on it. Although I was on that side before, I'll declare my bias prior to it. But he made a lot of very interesting points that were worth considering, worth addressing. I felt like Stefan did from his side of it. But in those answers, we explored deeper aspects of what is a contract. What is self-ownership? Because obviously from Walter's point of view, he's like, well, if I own myself, I can sell myself, and who are you to stop me? And without putting a spoiler alert, I still recommend people go and check this debate out because it's really interesting. But Stefan's kind of response for that wasn't so much that he was saying, well, it's not that you don't have the right to, it's more the fact that you can't really, because you can't ever get rid of your self-ownership. And
Right.
while you're, and all a contract really is a promise, your voluntary slavery contract, you're promising to act like a slave, but you could withdraw that consent and there might be penalties to pay, but would that penalty really justify enslaving you against your will, as it would be once you've changed your mind? And that's, like I said, I don't want to butcher, he said it better than himself, his argument, although as I say, I agree with it, so that's my perspective on it as well. And it's like that with all sorts of issues. Sometimes some issues there are very genuinely fuzzy, but some issues, I think, when you have that debate, it doesn't mean that Walter's like, oh yes, I'm right, wrong, and Stefan's like, oh, I'm right. But it's more of a case of everybody understood the opposite arguments much better, the reasons
Right.
why. I mean, even though I on Stefan's side of it, I still understand where Walter's coming from. I can see, I can understand where he's like, well, I own myself. Why can't I? And I
Yeah.
was, and you can, because that's kind of what you do with employment. But the point is if I sign a 5-year employment contract and I want to quit after a year, they don't get to enslave me for the other 4, and
Right.
that's kind of like the crux of it. But these are all really good. But again, it was another example of a debate that was done without any kind of, I don't know what the word is.
Animosity.
That's the
Really.
word. That is the word.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was done with full respect, full good faith. Both, Walter and Stefan I spoke to afterwards, they both enjoyed the debate, appreciated it. But we went into it with that spirit. And that's what I want to do with the Together Strong thing. I want to try and arrange discussions and debate. It doesn't always have to be debates because, we don't
Right.
have to disagree. But it's like where we do, we should debate it in good faith and see if we can kind of polish our own understandings and maybe change minds. And where we agree, we should also explore, because we should, delve deeper and find the principle underneath it and make sure, and refine our understanding. So, sorry, I'm going on a bit again.
No.
But yeah.
Honestly, I love what you're saying. I don't know if I don't know if you knew this or not, but in 2021 I published a book. It was my first book, and in there I talk a lot about how it's actually a good thing for people um, to deep dive their own views, and how it's not a bad thing to change your mind when new information presents itself. It's actually a sign of growth. And I talk about various different issues that I changed my mind on from the time I started writing the book to the time I published it. And during that journey was whenever I stopped being a minarchist libertarian to being an anarcho-capitalist, because I discovered Murray Rothbard, Walter Block, and Hans Hoppe, uh, and I got new information, and it made logical sense, and the logic carried through. And so I said, okay, now I have to change my position on this, and that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that you have to change your position for it to be good, but if you're receptive to it, at worst case scenario, you just walk away with a better understanding of the other side, and a better understanding of why you believe your current position. And those are also good things.
Yeah, I agree. The way I pitched it to Walter and Stefan when I invited them to be part of it, I said, look, we're just trying to get closer to truth.
Yeah.
And I think if we all do that together, put our egos aside, and just, really explore things like that and challenge each other with the idea that, one of the things I often do with the Nations of Sanity project is I practically beg people to scrutinize it. Tell me how this is wrong, because I'm sure it's right, but I really want to. One of the metaphors I used once was saying it's like if you created a vase that was indestructible, you would want to invite people to come and try and smash it with a
Right.
hammer or do whatever they can to it, because you're so certain that you've made something indestructible. And the more people try to break it and fail, and also if they can break it, you want to see where that weakness is. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And then maybe
So you can
rebuild
fix
it.
it.
Exactly. In fact,
And,
actually,
it's
sorry.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, please.
No, I was just gonna say it's funny that you bring all of this up, because I talked about my theory of natural ethics. I've kind of gotten an incomplete draft, but I actually reached out to Walter Block, Hans Hoppe, and Jeffrey Tucker, and sent this to them because I want them to critique it, evaluate it, provide me feedback to it, and also, on disagreement. Walter wrote the foreword to my first book, and he talks about in the foreword where in areas that we disagree, and yet we're perfectly okay. It's fine, So I just wanted to highlight that. It's really great. I love it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that kind of approach from people, and I think that's how we move forward, as a movement. And as you alluded to earlier, it's a very to call it an uphill battle is an understatement with regards to, people only need to throw out statistics of the percentage of people that even identify as libertarians, and then you get into all the problems of people that identify libertarians perhaps not being so much so, and and all of a sudden we don't look like we've got a strong army, but
Right. And the running joke that libertarians hate libertarians. There's truth to it. We're always fighting with each other, but honestly, I would really love it if we could stop stop with the whole "you're not a real libertarian" thing. It's become a meme at this point, but instead, actually approach it from a much more philosophical and academic approach, and understand that we can have these disagreements without, dehumanizing each other and saying, you're not actually this, and here's why. And I hate you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, that was very much a motivation with this whole Together Strong debate series, discussion and debate series, because it was about that. It's like, okay, well, if we disagree, let's kind of help each other with our debates, and and like I say, that was certainly the spirit of the first one I've done, and that's how I intend all the others to go on. So, and I hope I'll hope to arrange a few. One, funny enough, I mean it when I say I fully intend to read many more of your articles. I only read about 3 or 4 so far, and I was halfway through one of them but got interrupted, and I think that was the one. I don't know if this is the one that it's the first chapter of your book.
Oh yeah,
Is that the book you mentioned?
Yeah, that is the Liberty Solution. I did publish the first chapter for everybody to read on X in its entirety. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason I wanted to bring that up was because, I mean, a lot of what you've said in your articles, I haven't found anything to disagree with yet, so I'll keep looking. But one of the things that really resonated with me on that article was when you were talking about, I think you kind of described it as Lady Liberty and how she looks, and how she looks the same, but people describe her differently and stuff like that. And this comes to your point, because it's not about saying you're not a real libertarian because you're not describing liberty perfectly right. It's more about saying, no, you've got this aspect wrong, or you've got that aspect wrong. You know what I mean? Like, no, she's not got that color hair, or she doesn't wear those earrings, or whatever. I'm torturing the metaphor a bit, but but you get my point. And the reason why that really resonated with me, because apart from the fact that that is obviously my motivation with the Together Strong thing, is to let's try to see if we can really chisel out a consistent, coherent, unified understanding of what liberty actually does look like, at least where we can do that. But also, my Nation's a Sanity project kind of rides on that a little bit, because it's like, okay, well, if we're going to establish the NAP as law and everyone's got a totally different idea of what the NAP is, that's not really going to work very well. You know what I mean? So even if we achieve that very unlikely goal, it's like, and that was part of like the same as saying, okay, even if you come to the revelation that the only justifiably enforceable law would be the NAP, the non-aggression principle. And you're firm in that belief, and then the next step is, okay, well, how do you establish it, because you can't do it through ruling authorities. And then, like I say, that's how I had the whole peace agreement idea. Then even when you get to that point, and even if you think that that's nice and achievable, and these are all utopian dreams from where we are now, but even if you get to that point, then you still got the point. It's okay, well, even if everybody in the world agreed, yeah, we'll make the NAP the law and we'll do it through the terms of peace, and that's all good, if they've all got very different ideas of property rights, what is aggression and all of that sort of stuff, we're still got a big problem. And kind of the way I kind of look to solve that is to say, well, look, there is a right answer to most of these questions. There is a black and white that we can define and should define, and a kind of line in the sand that we can draw over our differing interpretations. And then where there genuinely is a gray area, like a genuine gray area, and I think we can whittle those down to a smaller area than they might at first appear, because I think a lot of areas that seem grey at first, when you really discuss and debate them, I think a black and white does actually kind of emerge from a lot of these questions. But where there is a genuine grey area, my argument is we can still take the approach that this is still defined by self-ownership. So self-ownership still gives you an answer to how you approach the grey area, if it's a grey area. So like, just an example that I've often used when I'm explaining this, I've often talked about like age of consent, which isn't just about age, it's about obviously mental competency and stuff like that. But let's just make it simple and just go stick with the age aspect of it, for example, and just say, okay, well, let's say we understand, and I'm assuming agreement here, so obviously feel free to cut in if there's anything you object to, but we understand, most of us, that there's a difference between a consenting adult and a vulnerable child, and we can draw that line, but where exactly we draw it is something that's a little bit more debatable, and reasonable people can say, okay, well, when does that happen? And the truth is there's not like an exact time for everybody, and it's not even an exact time for anybody. It's a gradual progression. And that's a good example of this kind of it's what Walter Block calls the continuum problem, where you can still have a distinction. And funny enough, the example I use in one of my articles is, I call it where the desert meets the grassland. And I kind of think of like a geographical situation of a big desert and a grassland, and as you slowly walk from one to the other, you're going to have this area in between where you're not sure if you're in either yet at the moment, because say it's become too arid to be obvious grassland, but it's not quite, there's still a few patches of grass, so it's not obvious desert. You're kind of in that in-between area. There's kind of characteristics of both. And that's a good, analogy for the whole child to adult thing as well, because where it becomes debatable is where there's some kind of characteristics of both areas and stuff. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but what I'm basically saying is okay, there you might have a genuine gray area. Let's say you've got let's say, and I'm just throwing numbers around here because, as I say, it's not even just about age, it's about mental competency as well. But let's just say we all agree kind of universally as a default without further explanation that say 14 to 21 was kind of like the range. So I mean 14 seems a bit young for me, but I know, like, for example, Germany age of consent is as young as 14. Over here in England it's 16 for sex, it's 18 for alcohol, 17 for dry. It's different ages for different things. I know in America it's different in different states and stuff. It's all different. My point is none of these, these authorities, if we accepted that, say, 14 to 21, just for argument's sake, was the grey area, my point is it's not the authority of a state or a community or a country or whatever to say what that is within that grey area, because it's a grey area. But I would say in that grey area, self-ownership doesn't tell us, exactly where we draw the line. But what it does do is tell us that if it is a grey area, it tells us who has the authority to make that, has that kind of discretionary authority within that grey area, that higher claim to make the decision within that grey area. And then with age of consent, I would argue it's the parents, because the parents are the guardians of the children. And if it's and everything else, and again, please tell me if you disagree with this, but I would say everything else we would agree, if it's a grey area of parenting, we would put it down to the parents. So for example, because there's a difference between disagreeing with how someone brings up their child and saying that's actually child abuse. You know what I mean? Where you'd feel justified in taking the child away from the parent. You'd need to have that kind of beyond reasonable doubt that what they're doing is truly in violation of their role as a guardian, their duty of care to their children and all of that. So what I'm saying is if it's a grey area and you don't have that, then you have to cede authority to the parents, because if it's a grey area, then they're the ones to kind of decide that, because they're the people with the duty of care, like the responsibility over their child that they own. And for you to take that away from them, you would have to kind of be able to say that they've crossed that line and they're not just in some kind of murky area where you're like, I'm not sure. Well, if you're not sure, then it's you leave them to it, kind of thing, Sorry, before I go on too much, I'm waffling a little bit, but what do you think of that?
So I'm actually trying to apply what I've written about my theory of ethics to this, because of the fact that the focal point, the foundation for every ethical question boils down to consent, right? If there is no consent, then it is objectively unethical, and if there is consent, it is objectively ethical. Now, I define consent as having 4 criteria. Consent must be truly voluntary, which means you can't be coerced into it. Consent must be informed, which means that you need to be well aware of all of the aspects. Or if you're entering into an agreement, you have to give them all of the information to which they're agreeing to. Whether they read it or not is up to them, but you have to you've fulfilled your ethical obligation if you present to them all of the information. So consent has to be informed. Consent has to be explicit. Now, I know that a lot of times we don't get the verbal yes, you go out to the bar with your buddies and you end up hooking up with somebody. There's no, hey, can we have sex discussion? And so it's kind of implied, but from a philosophical standpoint, I would say that implied consent is not valid, because only that person really knows if they're consenting or not. And that implied consent can really get you in trouble because you're not validating the consent. And then the other aspect is that dissent must be respected. So going back to that one night stand, if you're in the middle of having sex with somebody and they say stop, it's over, it's done, you stop. They have expressed their dissent, and it is not, if you continue, it is objectively unethical. So that's how I would apply it. And I don't approach the aspect of children in my edge cases section. Maybe I should, but I think that I could apply this rather easily, going back specifically to the informed consent criterion, because of the fact that naivety makes for a lack of informed consent. And so if somebody is trying to take advantage of that, what they're getting is, manipulated consent, which is invalid. So, as you would approach these types of gray areas and edge cases, there is an objective answer. We might, as human beings, because we're not omnipotent, might not ever be able to know that answer, but there is an objective truth, whether that person, if they're 16, 17, whatever their age is, they might objectively know, but that's not something that we can fully know. And so we should err on the side of dissent, societally, and I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with a culture saying 18 is our hard line. If it's 17 years old and 364 days, it's a no-go. And if it's 18 years, it's a go. For consent as being informed, there's nothing wrong with the society establishing that as a cultural norm. And we can get into the anarchist nuance there, if we want. But I think that if we can apply this ethical theory in that type of way, it kind of helps clear up a lot of those gray areas, at least to a significant degree. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with almost everything you said, bar the very end part about sort of cultures establishing these things, and or communities and stuff like that. But everything else you said, I fully agree with, and I feel like, I don't know if you do as well, but I feel like it echoes a similar sentiment to kind of what I said with regards to, like, um if you're gonna, like you say, we want to err on the side of caution, because you don't want to risk the kind of violation with regards to that. But I suppose if I could just justify my parent authority a little bit deeper, because it's funny. I had a debate with Mark Victor from the Live and Let Live project or movement. I don't know if do you know him or know that movement?
No, I do not.
Well, again, this is one of the things I'm trying to do, is get more people aware of more people. So now you're aware. But I had a kind of discussion debate with him. I'll send you the link to it, and I'll put a link in the comments as well, for this video for anyone who's watching this, because I thought, again, another interesting debate where he's got a project that's very similar to the Nations of Sanity, in the sense of saying, look, guys, let's get together, let's try to change our society so it's actually, libertarian. He calls it the live and let live principle. He kind of reframes the non-aggression principle a little bit, kind of adds a little bit more goodwill, with regards to let's be nice to each other as well as just respecting each other's rights, which is, fine. And for the most part, our two projects were almost kind of saying the same thing slightly differently. But the one area where we disagreed, and we kind of had a little debate on this aspect, was Mark's idea on things like grey areas was basically say, well, let communities decide grey areas. So he agreed with me about, we need to have our kind of universal, the law is the non-aggression principle, but we can draw a line and say, we can't let people take differing interpretations to the point where they're just violating the principle. We've got to draw a line so we can, otherwise we don't have a principle, if there's no line at all. But he said, but we both acknowledge there's grey areas, and he just said, well, why can't we just let communities have control over the grey areas? They can set age of consent, they can set whatever other grey areas there are, like disputes where there's not an obvious thing, they can kind of have that authority. And I'm like, my problem with that is, why should they? Where's that authority coming from? It kind of feels a bit arbitrary to me. Why should a cultural community have it as an enforceable law, a norm
Well,
is a little bit different. Look, go on.
here's how I would define that.
Okay.
I completely understand what you're saying, but this is where I would invoke the Hoppian aspect of ostracism. So if it, you know, if a society, their cultural norm for age of consent is 18 years old, and it comes out that some 38-year-old man has sex with a 14-year-old girl, and it becomes known, then the society would enforce that via ostracism. You know, his employer would terminate his employment. Nobody would ever want to do business with him, and he would be ostracized to the degree of likely having to relocate. And in this digital age, he probably couldn't relocate anywhere anyway, except in the middle of frickin' nowhere, and become a hermit. And you know, in my book, that's how I attack the problem of justice, is from this ostracism, because no matter what the no matter what the crime, even if it's something as heinous as cold-blooded murder, ostracism can have a huge effect on the individual that committed the crime. And you know, there is also this a culture could believe that you know, okay, we would ostracize somebody for cold-blooded murder, but we're not even going to ostracize somebody for revenge. So if somebody kills somebody and it comes out that, you know, like if Bob kills Brian, and you know, that becomes known and adjudicated in the private courts as being factual, however they, you know, the society wants to handle that, and it's known Bob definitely killed Brian, and John, who is Brian's brother, goes and kills Bob, and then nobody ostracizes John. Well, that's also perfectly acceptable. Unethical, sure, but the objectively unethical, sure, but the society has developed that this cultural norm that, you know, if you kill somebody who killed a loved one, then we're not going to ostracize you for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The only thing I would want to do is just to clarify a little bit and draw a distinction between because obviously from my point of view, I'm not talking about ostracism. I'm talking about kind of
Right.
law enforcement where we can use force. So, like for example, to take that the 38-year-old or whatever with the 14-year-old, let's say we're saying that's within our grey area, whether it's community or parent, whatever, you know, let's just say we're saying that's within our grey area. Um, okay, ostracism's fine because ostracism can be used for anything that's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, as well as things that are, if that's how people want to approach that. Again, who am I to tell people how they kind of, you know, adjudicate that? But when, you know, if it was a 4-year-old rather than a 14-year-old, then we would probably go a little further than ostracism. Then we probably would
Well,
use, you know,
I I openly admit, and I'm gonna be kind of a hypocrite here. You know, I would basically my theory of natural ethics would stipulate that anything that is done by force is unethical because the lack of consent, and that doesn't matter if there was a NAP violation or not. But that being said, I would happily violate my own ethical theory and feed somebody feet first into a wood chipper for having sex with a girl with you know, even if they were 14, because for me that's no, that's a child. In my
yeah.
view, that is a child, and I will happily feed you feet first into a wood chipper. Is it objectively unethical per my own theory of ethics? Yes. I have no problem with that.
Is it?
I hope it clarifies.
Is it? Yeah. But can I ask? Is it unethical? Like, I mean, I come from the point of view that, you know, enforcing the NAP, for example, even with force, isn't unethical. Like, you know, like I draw that distinction between defensive force. You know, for me, that's what the NAP is. It represents when you can use force in a justifiable way. So is it? I mean, maybe the
Well,
woodchipper thing, but you know, like, you know, but
so if it's true self-defense, as in, you know, somebody is an imminent threat to your life or your property, then yeah, force is justified because it's force from a defensive posture. But if that offensive threat no longer exists, then it would objectively be a violation and unethical because there is no active threat anymore, at least from my philosophy. So, this is my case against capital punishment, for instance, is that, this person is no longer a threat, and you are strapping them to a table without their consent and injecting them with pentobarbital until they stop being alive. That violates consent. That is unethical. Even if they've committed heinous crimes, I would argue that it is absolutely unethical. And again, calling out my own hypocrisy in this, if it came to somebody having sex with what I consider to be a child, I will happily pull a Gary Plauché, that's his name. I will happily pull a Gary Plauché and shoot somebody in the face for it.
Yeah, I sorry.
No, that was pretty much it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm on board with you on that one. I can think of plenty of examples where I would violate the non-aggression principle if I felt like if it was pushed to it in a certain circumstance. I can think of examples where I know,
Right.
according to my principle, I don't have the right to, use violence against that person, but then there's certain scenarios where I would, even though I didn't. You know what I mean? And and it's a little
reasonable
bit like
people being pushed to doing unreasonable things.
exactly.
Right?
And it's a little bit like that whole would you steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving child kind of thing. Yeah, you probably would. You know what I mean? Even the most
Yeah.
ardent libertarian would.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
still recognize it as theft, but
Yeah,
you'd be like, I don't
I would
care.
even in my theory that would be unethical. But honestly, I would still do that in if I were in that situation as well. So
Sure. Yeah. So no, I do understand that part of it, and I agree with you on that. I have to admit, I disagree about the it always be because I don't feel like the threat needs to be imminent. And I feel like as long as it's proportional and necessary, then I feel like it can be justified. So if you've got like a mass murderer and you've got him, it's like, okay, well, he's already proven his threat. We can't undo his crimes, but we can stop him from certainly doing any more. But also, perhaps it's like if you have these kind of things as a kind of pre-warning to not do the crime in the first place, like say, do not murder someone or we will murder you. It's like, well, that threat means nothing if we don't then do it once we've done it because of I tell you what, I don't know, because I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd love to discuss what we want here and now, but I wonder whether you'd be up for perhaps having like a debate on capital punishment or something like that, because I'm pro capital punishment if I feel like it for certain things. I think that would be a great as part of the Together Strong thing. I mean, I don't want to push you into a debate, but if that's something you'd be
no,
up for in another time, like we could dedicate a whole. I'm happy to talk
sure.
about it now as well, but I just feel like it deserves a dedicated kind of conversation or even a debate about it.
No, I would be down for that. I think that if we were gonna do it justice, no pun intended, it should be kind of its own discussion.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. So yeah, that would be a great, and that's a great example again, because I mean, as I said, I was reading your articles. I couldn't find anything to disagree with you about, but obviously having this conversation, there's a few things that have cropped up. But again, it's great because it's a great opportunity to learn more about. Okay, well, why do you feel this way? And let me tell
Yeah.
you why I think that's wrong, and let me consider your points to why you think I'm wrong. And you know what I mean? And it's like, so I really would look forward to that. But just to give you a little, perhaps this conversation can be a little bit of a kind of foundation for that. Because yeah, from my point of view, as I say, I'm not against the death penalty for certain things, and I do feel like enforcing the non-aggression principle with force is justified. I don't think the threat needs to be imminent. I think we can say that people don't have the right to do things to us, and we have the right to defend ourselves, even if it's retrospectively, if you know what I mean. Even if it's kind of like. I'm probably going to work on making these arguments more concise when we have our actual debate, so I've got it all a little bit more solid. But yeah, that's definitely where I'm at, and I'd be interested to hear kind of where you're coming from, and perhaps I'll get down to those articles that address this more specifically as well. But yeah, I just feel like and perhaps you could comment a little bit on this now in this conversation, is like, if we deny people the right to punish people afterwards, or enact a delayed response because we can't, we obviously everyone would rather stop the crime before it happened, but if we can't do anything about it once it's happened, are we not denying people kind of their right to self-defense in a way? Because we're kind of like, well, if you don't stop them, it's like they get a freebie. Kind of, it's like if they get away with it, they get away with it. If you know what I mean.
Well, I wouldn't. I don't particularly view it that way. If you're stopping if somebody is in progress of committing a mass shooting, for instance, and you show up with equal force, and they see you, and before you can fire around, they throw down their gun, get on their knees, and put their hands up. Uh, I would contend that you don't have the right to shoot them in the face. You know, uh, despite the fact that literally 10 seconds earlier they were murdering people. So, I mean, that's just kind of my take on it.
Okay. Yeah. Like I say, I don't agree, but I will I will think about it more, and I'll chew on it for a bit. But yeah, no, I do feel like that's kind of giving the criminals the aggressors a kind of one up. I mean, and just to kind of, I know you don't obviously agree with this position, but just to kind of let you know exactly where I'm coming from, because the thing is I don't feel like you can just do it. Like, I don't think you can execute someone for trespassing, for example, or like, for example, if someone stole your wallet and ran away, I don't think you could shoot them in the back, because I don't think that, again, that would be considered proportional or necessary. But yeah, I feel like you know using force after the fact against murderers and rapists, again, as long as you're meeting the criteria of proportional to the crime and kind of necessary in some way with regards to the threat that they've proven themselves to be going forward, as well as the fact that I think there's an argument for kind of having the credibility of that deterrent beforehand. You know what I mean? Like saying, like, don't, because the way I kind of view the non-aggression principle is it's very much a kind of, no one has the right to interfere with you unless you interfere with somebody. You know what I mean? And although I understand you do agree with that up to a point with regards to the imminent side of it, I just don't feel like the imminence is the defining factor that makes that valid. For me, it's the fact that you've aggressed, that you've violated, that you've kind of provoked some kind of responsive force that, like I say, as long as it's done within the spirit of being proportional and necessary, which again is somewhat of a grey area, but again, I would say self-ownership would put the authority in a certain place. And sorry, can I just complete also my little justification for the parent thing?
Yeah.
As well, because this kind of connects to it a little bit. But like, the reason why I argue, I mean, and again, I don't know if you fully agree with this either. So I'd be interested to know what you think. But I argue that parents have, because again, sorry, just to clarify also the relationship. I'm assuming too much with regards to, like, where we both stand on things. But like, some people, I've heard like people talk about their kids as being like their property or something like that, and I totally reject that idea. As far as I'm concerned, the only ownership a parent has with regards to their child is ownership over their duty of care. So if anything, they have an obligation towards their child rather than any kind of right. But part of that obligation, basically, sorry, I'm all over the place. Basically, what I'm saying is because as libertarians we reject positive rights, so we're all about the negative rights. It's not like you don't have a positive right for something. And a lot of people say, okay, well, why do you have to feed your kid and stuff like that? It's like, well, okay, because you don't have positive obligations, but you are responsible for your actions. And if you bring a child into this world, the metaphor I often use is, it's a little bit like if I push someone who can't swim into the water, say they were standing on a pier or something, like just push them in the water. I would be responsible if they drowned. I would be responsible for them drowning because I pushed them in the water. Now, if I didn't, they were just drowning and I walked on by, I wouldn't be responsible from a kind of law non-aggression principle
Right.
view. And I kind of liken this very much to the child thing. Like, I'm not responsible for feeding anybody else's children because I didn't bring them into this world. But my own child, who I brought into this world, it's like pushing someone who can't swim into water. They would drown if you didn't rescue them. And my child can't fend for himself. He can't consent to things. He can't, and all the rest of it. So it's like, I've put them in that peril. I'm responsible for them until they're either out of the peril I've put them or able to take care of themselves. Take that responsibility for themselves. So from my point of view, parents don't own their children, but what they do own is a duty of care, which makes them the rightful guardians of their children. And that's very distinct from ownership, because they can't just do what they want, but they do have a certain authority, again, over what I would argue over the gray areas of how they fulfill that duty of care as guardians. So that's why I would say we could only take someone's child from them if we could say that they've stepped over that line where it's not a grey area. They're actually abusing, they're no longer fulfilling their need as a guardian, they're abusing the child in some kind of, way that we can say with certainty. But if it's a grey area, like, we don't think that they exercise them enough, or, or even like the spanking thing, like, I don't think spanking is outside of the grey area unless it's very heavy-handed stuff. Now, I don't personally agree with spanking, and I don't practice it myself, so I understand people who say it isn't that violation. And again, that's another great debate. I remember Walter Block had it with Stefan Molyneux, who I'm not particularly a fan of, but they had a good debate on that particular subject many years ago. And again, this is another great example, because you hear the reasons from both sides. Well, like, Stefan's argument was like, well, why should you hit your child? They can't, protect back. And I agree with that. I don't think it's the right way to raise your children. But I'm also like, yes, but if it's purely disciplinary, even though I don't think that's the right way to go myself, is it over the line where I can say, okay, we'll take the child from them then, because they smacked them every time they've done something naughty or something, then I'm like, it's in the gray area. And unless I can say that they're actually, if they're actually beating them or something, it's a different story, and abusing them. But, smacking them once in a while because they, in that kind of way, I didn't feel like it was stepping over that line. And because it lacked that kind of beyond a reasonable doubt, then I didn't feel like we could override the parents' kind of authority. And that's why I have the same approach with age of consent, because I feel like it just falls under that category. And one other example I used when I was debating with Mark about it was to say, like, I mean, the vaccines are a good example of that, because you might say, oh, well, for different things, is it, should you have your children vaccinated, should you not? And I'm like, well, again, unless you can provide me some concrete, hard 100%, this child will definitely die without it, or definitely won't with, or whatever, then it's the parents' call. Because it's a little bit like, what do you feed your child? How much do they exercise? Can they have a computer? All these things. I might disagree myself and not parent that way myself, but if I can't say that they've actually crossed the line of clear and obvious violation, then I feel like we have to kind of leave them to it. So what are your thoughts on
that? So I talk about this in my book, and I try to tread very carefully with the words that I chose. And I'm going to do the same here, because it is it could easily be misinterpreted. And I'm trying really hard to not let it be misinterpreted. So I believe that children do own themselves. Flat out, they own themselves. And culturally, and from a human moral standpoint, which I differentiate from ethics, I believe morals to be subjective, and ethics to be completely objective and universal. But from a cultural and human moral standpoint, we should recognize the de facto hierarchy that is established between parent and child. But from a purely natural law standpoint, there is no real authority there. There is no real hierarchy there. And nothing that requires the labor of another person is a right, even if their very life depends on that. So you brought up, having to feed your child. From a purely natural law standpoint, it is not a natural law violation to do the incredibly egregious act of starving your child to death. That said, we should make sure that children are being fed by their parents. Again, going back to my own hypocritical stance of my own ethical philosophy, though it might not violate natural law, I would happily feed a parent into a wood chipper who starved their child. Okay. I just want to make sure that this
Yeah,
is
no,
clear. I'm not
yeah.
advocating that parents should starve their children. Because I know that what I'm saying here can easily be misunderstood, and even a soundbite can really like make it sound bad. And I'm just talking purely philosophical. I do believe that we should continue to accept the de facto hierarchy that is established between parent and child, and guardian and child if there is no biological parents involved. But from a purely philosophical standpoint, we have to also acknowledge that that doesn't legitimately exist. What are your thoughts on that?
I disagree a little bit. I can understand where you're coming from, and I don't disagree with your statement that children have self-ownership. But the way I kind of characterize it myself or justify that kind of hierarchical nature, apart from the kind of the bit I laid out already about, like, if you push them into the water and they drown, you're responsible for that. If I bring a
Right.
child into the world and they starve to death, I'm responsible for that kind of thing because I brought them into the world. So that's where I feel like I've gotten around the positive right element, because I've dodged that one, because I feel, or at least I feel like I have, because I feel like, well, I'm not giving a positive right. I'm just saying you're negatively responsible for, just like I'd be responsible for the person drowning if I push them in the water. I am responsible for my child starving because I brought them into this world, whereas I don't have that obligation onto other children. But the other thing about it is, I oh, I'm going to lose my train of thought now. I can feel it. Do you know when you have those mind blanks?
Yeah.
Ah, um, oh, sorry. Give me a moment. Oh, what was I going to say? It will come back to me in a minute, but
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, it's sometimes my mind just goes whoosh, even when I'm mid
Yeah.
sentence, and I've forgotten exactly what I was going to talk about. We're talking about, oh well, yeah, sorry, why parents have that right. Yeah, sorry. The one thing was, yeah, sorry, I'm back to it. I found it. The one thing was, obviously, as I say, that part of the duty care. But the other thing is, like, you have self-ownership. Let's say we're buddies and we know each other very well. I don't have any right over you, and you don't have any right over me. We're both self-owning individuals. But let's say you get hit by a bus and
Hmm.
you're unconscious, and then you wake up and you're all dizzy, or you get really blind drunk or something, and you're not fully there. Then I would say that I would adopt what I would call implicit consent, because I know that the true sober you would want me to not let you walk out into the road while you're dazed and confused, or would not want you to get in the car and drive if you're blind drunk. I know you don't want to do that. I know that. And I'm going to use that implicit consent to override what I know isn't your explicit informed consent that we've spoken about, because you're not your fully conscious self. It doesn't mean you don't have self-ownership. It just means you're not able to take the controls, if you know what I mean. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like it's your car, but you're not able to do that. And I kind of have the same attitude with the children. It's not that they don't own themselves. Yeah, sure they do. And my son has the right to rule his life once he has the understanding, and once he's gotten to that stage where he can take on the responsibility, because I feel like rights and responsibility go hand in hand. And if you don't have the cognitive ability to take responsibility for your actions, then you don't have the right to them either. It's kind of like and if you do have the right to them, then you have the responsibility that goes along with them. So just as I have the right to do what I want with myself, I also am responsible for what I do. And if I commit a crime, I'm responsible for the punishment. If I cause damage, I'm responsible for the the costs or whatever. If I push someone in the water, I'm responsible that they drowned. And my argument with the child thing is if I create a child, bring it into this reality, world, universe, whatever, and then just don't bother feeding it when I know that it can't feed itself, then I'm responsible for that. So I mean, I don't expect you to instantly agree with all that, but I hope that kind of clarifies why I have this perspective on this issue.
You know, I understand it. There's some nuance there that I would say I clash with a little bit. Um, you talked about implied consent. I don't find implied consent to be valid. But there is an objective truth. You know, we'll talk. Say I'm in a coma, and it's not looking good, and doctors have recommended that it's probably best just to take me off life support or whatever. And you are a loved one who knows me very well, and let's say that we have never had a conversation about what to do in a situation like this. Now, because I can't actually consent because I'm in a coma, uh, you know, I think this is where morals come in. Now, your moral compass, as you know, would say it's probably best, let's go ahead and take him off life support. But there is still an objective truth as to what I would decide if I were able. And you don't have that knowledge. Nobody does, because I'm the only one who does, and I'm incapacitated. Uh, you should be guided by your morals and, not be held ethically accountable for it. But there is still an objectively ethical answer to this that human beings just can't know, because we're not omnipotent. We can't read minds. And, that decision could be unethical, because if I were able to consent, I would not. I would express my dissent, despite the fact that you know me very well, and you're evaluating everything that you know. You're being guided by your own moral compass and what you know about me, doctor's advice, the whole thing. You're getting all of the information to make an informed decision, but it's from an ethical standpoint, it's not really your decision to make. Morally, it might be, depending on your morals. But ethically, it's not. Objectively, ethically, the decision is mine, even if I can't voice it. And so you do run the risk in situations like this of making an unethical decision. You'll never know if it was ethical or not, because I will end up being dead, right? But objectively, that answer still is tangible. It is still there, even if we as humans can't know it, if that makes sense. Does that track?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. And also I just want to add or repeat perhaps your disclaimer that I do understand the difference between morals and ethics that you're drawing here. And you're not, just because you're saying something's not a NAP violation doesn't mean you're saying that you agree with it, and vice versa. Just because you're saying it is not a NAP violation doesn't mean, so I do understand what you're saying with that regards. I do, again, slightly disagree on that, because I do feel like, because I mean, I don't think that implied consent can ever override explicit consent. So, for example, if I saw someone about to be hit by a bus, I push them out of the way. I would invoke implied consent. I'm like, well, surely you want me to push you out of the way. But let's say, for example, he says, no, I don't want you to push me out of the way. And then if I push him out of the way, then I have. So that's the distinction I kind of draw from the. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do understand you separated ethics and morality, and one, I do understand what you're saying. But I would still argue that I haven't violated the ethics, because, as I say, I do think implied consent is a valid thing, because I feel like it's only valid when explicit consent is unobtainable.
So again, I would disagree, but here's the thing: we act under implicit consent all the time, even though I fundamentally believe that it's not valid. Uh, and a lot of the times, our assumption that the person is implying consent is actually turns out to be true. You know, because that person actually does consent. Just didn't specify beforehand, yes, I consent to that. So that's not to say that it's unethical in and of itself to act under an assumed and implied consent because your moral compass guides you to that. All it's saying is that there is a risk that your actions could be unethical. Did you ever see The Incredibles?
Yeah.
Okay. So at the beginning of The Incredibles, Mr. Incredible saves this man that's falling off of a building. And the man says, "You didn't save my life, you ruined my death." Right? He dissented to being saved. But, because he really wanted to kill himself. And he was saved without his consent because of the assumed implied consent that he needed to be saved by Mr. Incredible. And that's kind of what I mean by we run the risk. Yeah, morally, it's probably the right thing to do with us personally. And I'm just going to clarify here. The reason that I keep making these separations is because common scholarship on ethics and morals are one and the same. Like if you look up the definition of ethics, it has the word morals in it. And I really want to make a hard line that they are actually two different things. Ethics is not moral philosophy. They are separate. But anyway, so that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's unethical. It's inherently unethical to act because you're assuming consent. I'm saying that you run the risk of an unethical act by not getting explicit consent. Does that clarify things a little bit?
Yeah, no, I understand fully. I mean, it's funny, it made me laugh when you said that because I immediately pictured me as Mr. Incredible's lawyer and you as the other guy's lawyer. Because, as I say, from my point of view, I'd be like, well, he is, because he didn't know. If the guy the next day said, "Look, don't save me this time," then Mr. Incredible was violent. From my perspective, but no, again, and I do understand. I mean. And I will confess, to me, morals and ethics have always been the same thing. But I do understand what you're saying. And the distinction you're drawing, I would just use different language, but I understand the same distinction. I would just call it objective morality versus subjective morality. So what you're calling ethics, I would have described as like the objective morality. And then what you're calling morality, I would just call that the subjective morality. But it's the same thing. That's
Right.
another thing as well. I think that we should all make more effort to do is if we understand what the other person's saying, even if they're using slightly different language, we should break through that and not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's like, yeah, because I'm one of the, you say like most people, ethics and morality is the same thing. Yeah, but that's exactly how I've always thought about it. But I understand what you're saying. I understand when you're talking about ethics, you're describing this kind of objectively this principle based on the non-aggression principle, and when you're talking about morality, you're talking about that kind of what is truly subjective, that kind of higher kind of, well, we kind of know it in an instinctive way or but not in a way that we can kind of map to a principle and point to it in an objective way. So yeah, no, that's a perfect, like I say, I agree with the distinction, even if I would have used different language, but I can still understand what you're saying about it. And one question I would ask though, with regards to like the example you gave about being on life support, is the reason why you're saying it would be unethical for someone to come on, is either decision unethical? Is them just making any decision at all?
No. What I'm saying is that we won't ever know whether the decision was ethical or not. Because me being incapacitated, I can't give consent. But if I was able to, I would make a decision one way or the other. But because I can't, your decision, you run the risk of either aligning with of what I would consent to, or you're violating my consent because I wouldn't have consented to it. That's the risk that you're running. So you making the decision isn't inherently unethical. We just will never know if it was truly ethical or
Right.
not because of the fact that I wasn't able to voice that, if
Okay,
that makes sense.
I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, because I wasn't sure whether it was the fact that it's like whether it was like a positive action versus doing nothing, or whether it was about, like you say, not knowing what the person truly wants, and it's the latter. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of an important clarification for me to understand your argument as well, because um, I get what you're saying there. Because I mean, I suppose the reason why I have trouble jumping on board with this is because I feel like, well, we can only ever act with what we know, and although there is the kind of being like reckless disregard and stuff like that. There's something you could, there's situations where you might not know something, but you should have known. You know what I mean? Or you
Yeah.
could have known. You had every opportunity to know. But then there's often a lot of things where you have no way of knowing, kind of
Yeah.
thing. Um,
And we can do, and honestly, this kind of challenges us as human beings to make sure that we do uh kind of keep our affairs in order. Like my wife and I, we have had conversations about what to do if one of us is incapacitated and it looks like, it's not going to happen. It's not good, right? And a lot of people also do that, whether they have, DNRs or living wills or whatever. And that should then take place of your consent, because that is legitimately their wishes. That is the knowledge that you're seeking. But I just use examples like this to highlight the objectivity of
yeah,
it all. Even though I can't voice it in that specific point, if I were able to, I would voice it one way or the other. And the decision being made is either going to align with what I would do or not. And that is what determines whether or not it's ethical or unethical. But because we can't know what I would decide, I guess you could call it ethically ambiguous. We just can't know, again, because we're not omnipotent.
yeah. No, I understand fully what you're saying. I mean, basically, what you're saying is it's about it's a matter of fact that your consent was violated. Whether that person, whether you could really blame that person because they obviously couldn't had no way of obtaining what your consent would be, but it's a matter of fact that you wanted to go one way and something else was done. But I suppose from my point of view, I'm like, even though that is obviously true, it would be a matter of fact. Like, say, for example, someone acting on your behalf chooses the wrong thing in relation to what you actually would want or do want or whatever. Um, Although I do accept what you're saying about, as a matter of fact, it is simply true that your consent was violated.
Yeah.
I suppose because of the kind of inability for the person to kind of, yeah, I suppose I get where you're coming from. I mean, like I say, I'm not ready to just jump on board with that, because I still kind of feel like implied consent is a valid thing. I obviously, all these scenarios where I feel like someone, because the problem is if you're in that situation, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, or you've got no,
Oh yeah.
or to be more precise, you don't know if you're damned if you do or you're damned if you don't. So
I would put it like this. I would say that you making that decision in that time would technically be ethically neutral. Just because, well, I honestly, I kind of like my phrase ethically ambiguous. And that is to say that, and here's the thing, not every unethical action requires societal punishment, right? Um, well, to a degree, I would say. If my ethical theory is based wholly on consent, then I would say that in cases like this, uh, even though it may objectively be unethical, we shouldn't punish somebody for doing genuinely what they believe is morally correct. Um, even if later we could prove otherwise, because you're in that moment, if that makes sense. Well, you've heard of the trolley problem, right? The
yeah,
classic trolley problem. Okay. Uh, you're in an out of control trolley. There's five people tied to the tracks, and you can pull a lever to divert to a side track where one person's tied to the track. So either way, you're going to kill either five people or one person. I would argue that applying my ethical theory here, that the trolley operator is in an ethically neutral situation, because it's not their fault. The unethical act was whomever the unethical burden falls at the feet of whoever tied those people up on the tracks to begin with. So to kind of clarify everything, I would say that in those edge cases where consent can't be given, we should view it as ethically neutral, even though there is an objective, ethical or unethical answer that we just can't know.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I suppose the only thing I would ask though is what if in the trolley situation we took your what you said before with regards to the kind of ethics of making a decision that goes against somebody's thing. What if in the trolley situation, one track it's one person, and the other track there's no one, but the person, unbeknown to you, tied himself to those tracks because he's suicidal and wants to die. See, now my point of view is as well. Okay, if you have no way of knowing that, and
Well,
so
again,
from my
I would say that I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I would say that it's ethically neutral because uh you can't imply consent there, right? You can't imply that he tied himself up there because he's suicidal and that's his wishes. You you see a sidetrack that is safe, so you know you would pull the lever and divert. And I would say that that's still ethically neutral. But here's the kicker. Even if you don't know whether it's him being there is actually consensual, and we'll say that it objectively is, he's suicidal, and you do nothing, I would still say that your actions as the trolley operator are still ethically neutral because of the consent that was there.
what if it's about to hit him and you let it? You mean?
And yeah, if you let it, and he was there on his own consent because he's suicidal, I would still say that it was ethically neutral with my theory.
Okay. But you can see where I'm coming from with that, I think, though. You know what I mean? Because it's
Right.
like, because from my point of view, I'm like, okay, well, you've got a scenario where you've got people dying either way. And you're like, okay, well, that I can understand you saying that's kind of ethically neutral because you're not responsible for that situation. And whatever you do, someone's dying and you didn't put them in there. But when you're in a situation where one of the ways is, no one's dying and one of the ways is, and without explicit knowledge that that person did it themselves and is suicidal, it seems that you're. I mean, I suppose from my point of view, I would be invoking implicit consent to save that guy, just like I would with the pushing the guy out of the way of the bus and the other examples I gave. Like it's like without explicit consent. Because I suppose that's another reason why I struggle to let go of implicit consent because it's so necessary so often in our lives. Like we, as you said yourself, we use implicit consent so much. It feels like, and that, and perhaps that's not the best argument because I'm not invoking the principle. I'm almost talking from a pragmatic point of view by saying that, like, how could we function if we never ever invoked implicit consent? We'd never be able to bring a child into the world. We'd never be able to look after sick and infirm people. I mean, it's like, but that's to be honest, that's not a principled argument. And I still got like from the principle point of view because like we can only act with what we've got. But no, I understand where you're coming from though. I do see what you're saying.
And again, going back to implicit consent, most of the time where we kind of invoke implicit consent, we're taking a bet, and most often it pays off in that the person actually did consent. They just didn't voice it. They know whether or not they are actually consenting to this, one way or the other. But without that expressed, explicit, voiced consent, all we as humans are doing is running the risk of committing an unethical act. So, and again, it goes back to, you implying that you're trying to save somebody, you're trying to save somebody because you think that they would want you to save their life, but if they're suicidal and you save them, then you have actually violated their consent, which is objectively unethical. They had the right to do that, and despite the fact that morally you're correct, ethically you're not.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and like I said, I do get the distinction you're making with the moral versus ethics on that. Um, I keep getting images of The Incredibles now, and me and you acting as
I,
though
it's a good analogy. It really is.
Well, it is as well, and it's like, and I do feel like in if we put ourselves into that universe, I would be Mr. Incredible's lawyer, and you would be the suicidal guy's lawyer, because I would be on Mr. Incredible's side. We're saying well, he didn't give explicit consent, and without explicit consent, we can only use implicit consent. And then you would also say, well, regardless, he violated his consent, and it's
I would actually tell the other attorney, I'd be like, look, if he really wants to die, he should go kill himself now instead of suing him. Uh,
well, yeah. Well, that was another thought. I thought, well, you can always do it tomorrow, mate. You know what I mean? Now I know not to save you, so yeah. We've been talking for a little over an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. I could talk for longer because I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I really enjoy getting your perspective on these kind of moral roots and the sort of philosophical foundation of these different perspectives. So, is there anything you kind of want to sort of cover before we kind of wrap it up, or?
no, just my book, The Liberty Solutions, on Amazon and Audible. You can hear my sexy voice narrate it the entire time. Um, and I have various essays on X that I publish, never behind a paywall. So, you're free to read and share with everybody. And that's ultimately the goal. This theory of ethics that I'm working on, I've sent it to, as I mentioned, I sent it to Walter Block and Hans Hoppe, and to kind of get their takes on it, because I really want to do this correctly before I fully publish it. But what we've talked about here is basically the foundation of it. So yeah, that's pretty much it, man. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed it. I hope to speak to you again. I'd love to kind of explore some of these subjects again. And yeah, and if you're up for doing that debate on capital punishment, we'll get that arranged somewhere as well, if you're up for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be great. Okay, well, yeah, I will put links to your work in the description. I highly recommend people check you out if they don't already. As I say, I've really enjoyed, and I will 100% be reading more of your articles, because even where I disagree with you, I find it really interesting hearing your arguments for why, and I will consider them. I'm not above changing my mind, so it's we'll see. But um I'll share some of my work with you as well. And obviously, if there's anything else I kind of pop up that I think is worth talking about, then I'll if you're open to invitations, then you're going to get plenty from me, because I really appreciate talking to people that are good faith and serious, and that want to have the conversations. I think a debate on capital punishment would be great, and a great addition to this Together Strong project, where different subjects are tackled with sort of good faith approach debate. So yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope to speak to you again. I recommend everybody checks you out. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, and I have had a great time. This has been a great talk, and I will happily come back if you ever invite me back. So,
Well, I definitely will. So I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
you
Thank
too.
you.
Thanks a lot.